The evening of my 40th birthday was intended to be one of those beautiful nights you see in movies, where everything sparkles with delight and everyone smiles like they mean it. I'd spent weeks visualizing it. Me standing on that rooftop venue, the metropolitan cityscape extending out below, lights glittering like stars pulled down to earth. The room was dripping with elegance, all polished glass and sleek furniture, the kind of spot where you feel important just by being there. Juliana, my wife, had organized it all, and she looked wonderful, gliding through the crowd in her deep red dress, beaming at me like I was the only man in the world. The guests? They were the city's big shots, bankers, politicians, people with names you'd see in the media. They laughed, they raised their glasses, toasting me, wishing me well. I felt like I'd made it, like all the hard years had finally paid off, and then, out of nowhere, it all came apart. I was talking to some guy, a stock trader, I guess, when Juliana's father, Philip Lancaster, walked up beside her. He was a tall man, usually dressed like he was about to close a $1 billion transaction. His gray hair was slicked back, his eyes piercing as knives. He leaned in close to her, his lips barely moving as he murmured something. I didn't catch what he said, but I saw the difference in her immediately. Her hand tightened around her champagne glass so firmly, I thought it might shatter. Her shoulders turned stiff, like someone had pulled a string tight inside her. Before I could even ask what was wrong, her fist flew up and cracked across my face. The sound echoed through the room, cutting through the music, the chatter, everything. The sting hit me first, then the shock. I stumbled backward, my hip crashing into the edge of a table. Plates clattered. A glass tipped over and smashed. I went down. Hard. And then, silence. You could have heard a pin drop. Every eye was on me, then on Juliana, then back to me again. My cheek burned, but what hurt more was the look on her face. Cold, distant, like she didn't even recognize me. Then, she turned to walk away, her heels clicking on the shiny floor like she'd just completed some task and was done with it. I lay there, my mind racing, betrayal twisted in my gut, hot, heavy. She'd humiliated me in front of everyone, and I didn't even know why. But then, something broke inside me. I started to laugh, low at first, then louder, a dark, bitter chuckle that rolled up from my chest. Juliana stopped dead in her tracks, her head tilted, just enough for me to see her face, the color drained from it. She looked like she'd seen a ghost, or maybe something worse. She knew. She knew what I'd done. I forced myself up, ignoring the pain in my hip, ignoring the stares boring into me. That laugh, it wasn't just noise, it was a signal, a warning. I'd spent years playing the dutiful spouse, smiling at her father's directions, nodding along as he pulled strings I couldn't see, but I wasn't blind anymore. I had been watching, digging, waiting. And tonight, on my 40th birthday, that moment had arrived. Juliana's slap wasn't just an attack, it was the spark that lit the fuse. She thought she'd won. That she'd put me in my place. She didn't know the half of it. I wiped a hand across my mouth, tasting the faint tang of blood where my lip had split. And I smirked. The game was on. And I was done pretending. Conditioning, they called it. Philip wasn't simply directing her what to do. He'd rewired her to obey him. I sat there in my workplace that morning, staring at the screen, my coffee cold in my fingers. The paperwork said it all out. Dates, amounts, even comments from Whitmore concerning development. Juliana wasn't only under her father's thumb. She'd been programmed, turned into something he could manage with a few muttered words. My chest constricted as I read it. Rage mixed with something heavier. Grief, maybe. The woman I'd married, the one I'd laughed with, fought with, loved. She wasn't really there. Part of her belonged to him, fashioned by his hands, his money, his nasty ideals. I wanted to shatter something, to storm into the bedroom and shake her awake, ask her if she even realized what he'd done. But I didn't. I couldn't. Not yet. Instead, I kept reading, my eyes burning from the screen glare. The payments went back years, commencing just before we were married. Philip had planned this, probably from the moment he met me. I was never part of the family. I was a tool, a way to keep Juliana connected to the trust fund until the 5 years were up, and tonight, at my birthday celebration, he pulled the trigger. That's what hurt me most. Whatever he'd spoken to her afterward, whatever made her smack me in front of everyone. It wasn't random. It was his ultimate command, the last step in his plan. He'd constructed her to follow him, to do what he wanted without question, and I'd been too blind to stop it. But now, I saw it all. Every whisper, every mood swing. Every time she pulled away from me, it wasn't her, it was him. I closed the laptop, my hands shaking a little. The water was still running. Juliana was getting ready, probably singing to herself like it was any other day. I lay back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, trying to breathe through the wrath. Philip believed he'd won, thinking he could play me like he played her. But he didn't know I'd unearthed his dirty little secret. Tonight wasn't just my birthday. It was his deadline. The day Juliana's inheritance locked in. He'd surely urge her to embarrass me, to make sure I stayed in line or went away for good. But I wasn't going anywhere. Not like that. I had the truth now, and I was going to use it. Philip's strings were real, but they weren't unbreakable, and I was done being his puppet's husband. Screens, their faces twisted as they read the files I'd given out. Philip's financial trickery, the payments to Dr. Whitmore, the proof he'd been pulling Juliana's strings for years. The quiet music from the speakers was drowned out by the buzz of phones and the faint hum of worried voices. News alerts started coming up, loud and fast, cutting through the air. Lancaster family under inquiry. Once sealed stunning charges of behavioral manipulation. Another Blair. I didn't need to look. I'd written the headlines in my head, months ago, fitting it all together in my office as Juliana slept. Now it was real, and it was everywhere. Philip tried to take charge, like he usually did. He stepped forward, his words ringing over the audience, calling me unstable, a liar, a nobody who'd lost his mind. "This is nonsense," he yelled, his hands slicing through the air. "He's desperate, making up stories to tear us down." A couple of his supporters nodded, murmured agreement, but most of the room wasn't buying it. They kept scrolling, their eyes bouncing between him and their phones, doubt creeping in. I stood there, my hands in my pockets, letting him talk. He thought he could still win this, talk his way out like he'd done 1,000 times before. But this wasn't some boardroom he could intimidate. The proof wasn't just words on a page, it was alive, incontrovertible. And I'd made sure of that weeks ago. I'd taken a risk. I'd planted tiny mics in Philip's secret study, the one place he thought was safe. A wood-paneled room in his mansion, full of leather chairs and old books, where he'd sit with his whiskey and formulate his plans. I'd snuck in during a family dinner, pretending I needed the bathroom, and hid them behind his desk, behind a picture frame, someplace they wouldn't be seen. Everything he'd spoken since then, every call, every meeting, I'd recorded. I'd listened to hours of it, late at night, my headphones on, weeding through the uninteresting stuff to locate the gold, and I'd noticed it. The files I sent out weren't simply paperwork,